how should this issue have been dealt with as a state here in Utah? Let's maybe start there. So, Taylor, when you look back at the last months or years of these kinds of issues being debated, what advice would you give to say, well, in the future, guys, here's how we should be addressing these kinds of things?
Well, what is so hard about this, Nick, is that the Constitution is really very clear, and Bill has explained that so well throughout our show here today. However, unfortunately, politics has completely derailed this process and gotten us away from the Utah Constitution with how we ended up with the maps we have today. And in my opinion, in my experience, this all can really be tied back to how the Utah legislature engaged politically and with the public when it came to the map drawing process. That the way they went about this, they completely disregarded and disrespected the input from the Independent Redistricting Commission. Now, if I had been advising them at that time, I would have encouraged them to embrace the input, to welcome the suggestions from the commission and from the public. But because the legislature was seen as being very dismissive and very uninterested in that kind of input, I think that set the stage for the litigation that was filed just a few years later. The outcome of the redistricting process certainly created a bit of an optics opportunity for the plaintiffs in that case, right? Dividing Mill Creek in four districts in a neighborhood there, that's not a problem if you really look at how redistricting is done. You have to divide Salt Lake County somewhere just because it's so large population wise. But the optics of how the legislature went about redistricting and the optics and the politics of the perception among Utah voters really set the stage for the litigants to have a successful case.
Bill, looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently if you could have influenced this process from the beginning?
Well, there's probably many good reasons why I'm not the one in charge. But having said that, I would put a lot of emphasis on the role of the Utah Supreme Court. I think that's where things went drastically wrong. The Utah Supreme Court, pardon me, ruled in 2024 that legislatures could not amend ballot initiatives. You have a ballot initiative that was passed, reflecting the intention of the people to get the attention of the legislature. But the court treated it without any, as far as I can see, legal justification for doing that, as a kind of like a quasi-constitutional amendment. I mean, that it's sort of it can't be changed, it can't be touched, and that undermined the value of what the Constitution had done. It prevented the people and the legislature from interacting with each other and getting a better process. For instance, I think the legislature has said that they're concerned by some of the kind of vague standards that were in Proposition 4, and that's a reasonable concern. And they could respond to that by making amendments, and did, and that seemed to be going well. But the challenge is then the court said, well, no, actually, there's no role for the legislature to play. They have to leave it to us, the courts, to determine whether what the legislature does is in the spirit of what voters wanted. That insertion of the court into the process was really it distorted the process dramatically, and it's prevented, I think, better decisions, and probably my personal opinion, probably contributed to what Taylor described, where the different parties are kind of ignoring each other and not working together constructively, as I think the sharing of power in the constitutional system was intended to promote.
I'm so glad Brill brings that up because I have direct knowledge of this. And at the time, Proposition 4 was those standards, right, that should govern the redistricting process. Those standards were written to be intentionally vague so that any future redistricting process could be subject to challenge via litigation. That was the intent of the sponsors at the time with those standards. The legislature knew that was the case. They recognized that. That's why we got SB 200, the compromise bill, in the session just following passage. It was to clarify those standards to avoid going down a path of litigation every time the legislature tried to draw maps. And so Bill's exactly right that the state Supreme Court ruling last year really creating a super law, a super category of statute, a statute passed by initiative, that is hugely problematic, right? Constitutionally. I'm, again, not a lawyer. I just pretend to be one sometimes. I have used Utah's initiative process here in Utah many times. It is something I truly believe in. But more importantly, I believe that any language passed by initiative should be subject to improvements, refinements, changes by our constitutionally elected legislature.
Well, for both you guys, as we round out this episode, I mean, these conversations to me are so important because this gets to the core of what I think sometimes is frustrating for voters on either side of the issue, but also to these core questions of just how we govern ourselves, how we make decisions, and weaving in the politics of it, the policy, the constitutional language. It just feels like one of those really important conversations to get right as a state. And in that context, I want to ask you both as we wrap up here, and Bill, I'll start with you, then Taylor will give you the last word. I want to ask you both, if you were advising leadership here in Utah, if you were advising the court system, the legislature, and just voters generally about, okay, here's what we do next. Here's how we should fix all of this. Here's a good process for this moving forward that complies with the Constitution, that, and includes in some way the what voters have said they want, and with the legislative role. Is there any way to sort of tie all this together in a good, constructive process moving forward? Bill, we'll start with you, and then Taylor, ask you to answer the same question.
There's probably lots of things, and Taylor, I'm sure, will give a better answer. But I'll start with the court will have the chance to reconsider its prior decision because the legislature is going to be, as we understand, appealing Judge Gibson's decision to them in a timely way. And so I think this is a chance to pull back on the kind of broad interpretation of the Constitution and stick to their role. I think that will remove one of the distorting factors out of this discussion. But then I think it's helpful for voters and the legislature, like Taylor's described, to think carefully about what we learn from the structure of our state constitution. It's wise. It's measured, and what do we lose when we jettison that that carefully created structure? So I think for instance, just as a simple example, voters need to remember that elected officials that they want to make these decisions include their legislators, and they need to be involved. And more individuals involved in that process of selecting elected officials is likely to create a better result in future discussions and make for more responsiveness. So I think that would be just maybe some relatively simple.
Taylor, close us out. What's the path forward on this issue for Utah in your view?
That's the question, Nick. And I wish I had a really clear slam dunk answer for you. I know in their press conference this morning, legislative leaders, followed, of course, by Governor Spencer Cox, proposed some possibilities. This is a bit of a kitchen sink approach here. They're going to try a number of different things, anything they can to try to address this issue. I would maybe issue a word of caution with our elections. Anytime it comes to Utah's election process, I think we need to be very careful with monkeying around with deadlines and requirements. Utah has the gold standard when it comes to elections. No process is perfect. Ours isn't perfect, but our elections are really well administered. They're trusted. Our voter participation rate in Utah has increased dramatically in the last decade. So I would caution legislators against messing around much with the election process or with timelines. Really, my advice would be that the best path forward is to do, frankly, exactly what we're doing here right now, which is to ground all of our conversations, all of our rhetoric, and all of the debate about this issue in the Constitution. We need to get back to the Utah Constitution and turn from just the partisan politics about gerrymandering and start communicating more with voters about what the Constitution says, why it says that. And for that reason, I would seriously consider a constitutional amendment put forward to the Utah voters to further clarify this issue over redistricting. I really think we need to get back to the Constitution. And in that sense, going back to it is the best way forward.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.